Hello and welcome. My name is Carolyn Grimminger. I'm the co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Our program's mission is to nourish the mind and spirit and serve social justice. Our forums occur on most Sundays at noon in the sanctuary and are free and open to the public. We encourage all to attend. Our church is physically located at 4700 Grover Avenue. For more information about our Public Affairs Forum, you can go to our church website, www.austinuu.org. Today's speaker is Bob Cash, and the topic of his presentation is Turning Toward Fair Trade. Eric Hartman will now introduce Mr. Cash.
Thank you very much. It's my honor today to introduce the perfect guide to this topic of the potential for a turn toward fair trade in American policy. We have a bit of a turning point right now, so turn is the right metaphor, I think. Question is what we're turning toward and who's doing it. So I think it's going to be very valuable for us to hear from the director of the Texas Fair Trade Coalition. Bob has been laboring in these vineyards for many years on many a battle over trade policy. Before that, he was a longtime leader on the progressive side in the Texas House of Representatives as a chief of staff to a state rep from Houston. His pedigree as a labor activist goes back so far I can't even begin to recite all of his involvements. I perhaps can leave it to him to indicate what some of those are. But I want to also stress that in the context of working on the issue of trade, it's not just about trade. As you'll hear from him, it's about consumer protection. It's about environmental protection. It's about the terms on which we deal with one another domestically and who wields the power in the economy. So it's critical that we have I think, a sound understanding of what this issue is really all about as we go into the next few days and months when we'll be seeing what various folks have to say about what comes next on trade policy. So I won't keep filibustering. I just wanted to give you an idea of why I'm so keen on hearing this from Bob, and I'll let Bob take it from here. Thank you, Bob, for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. Eric was talking about my labor background. I've been either a member or a staff member of 12 different unions, which I guess shows I can't keep a job. But really I guess the first time I became interested in this issue and didn't even realize it was the issue of free trade was I was a worker, factory worker at Hughes Tool Company in Houston, oil tool concern. And sometime in the 1980s we had a guest come, and that guest was Deng Xiaoping, the chairman of the Communist Party of China. And we took 2 weeks cleaning up the place and not doing any real work. But he did tour the plant. I was one of those that they considered perhaps too outspoken to allow to stay there while he was on premises. So I actually didn't see him. But the joke among former Hughes Tool workers was that we didn't realize he was measuring the drapes, because within a few years we had lost all our jobs, and it wasn't directly, at that point it wasn't directly because of any free trade agreement, but we did notice that Hughes Tool had opened plants in China, in Singapore, in Brazil, and those plants seemed to be still operating while ours was basically being shut down. Earlier this year, I had a chance to give a presentation on TPP to the AFL-CIO convention, in which actually, because I wanted to give people an idea of the kind of videos, kind of educational videos that are out there on TPP. I said very little, and we played, I think, 5 videos, which, of course, several of my good friends came up afterwards and said, "That's the best presentation you ever gave. You hardly said anything." So today I did want to, as a shorthand, play a couple of videos first, and then I'll start my presentation. The first is a video put out by Robert Reich, who was the former Secretary of Labor in the Bill Clinton administration, and was not only a promoter of, but an architect of NAFTA, of the North American Free Trade Agreement, the first of the trade agreements that the U.S. had began promoting in the 80s. And it's very interesting at this point, Robert Reich has decided that really, in some ways, it's his baby. Didn't turn out too well. And he has come out against not only the TPP, but the entire concept of free trade agreements, or at least the way in which free trade agreements have been negotiated up to this time. If you could play that first video.
Republicans in Congress are eager to work with the Obama administration to fast-track the passage of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. If you haven't heard much about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that's part of the problem right there. It would be the largest trade deal in history, involving countries stretching from Chile to Japan, representing 792 million people and accounting for 40% of the world economy. Yet it's been devised in secret. Lobbyists from America's biggest corporations and Wall Street's biggest banks have been involved, but not the American public. The pharmaceutical industry, for example, they get stronger patents, delaying cheaper generic versions of drugs. Big corporations and Wall Street get an international tribunal of private attorneys outside any nation's legal system. They can order compensation for any lost profits found to result from a nation's regulations. That means even U.S.-based corporations could challenge any U.S. government regulation they claim unfairly diminishes their profits. Say, laws that protect American consumers from unsafe products or unhealthy foods, that protect workers, block toxic emissions, or prevent another taxpayer-funded bailout of Wall Street. The Obama administration says the trade deal will boost U.S. exports, but the deal will also allow American corporations to outsource even more jobs abroad. In other words, it's a Trojan horse in a global race to the bottom, giving big corporations from Wall Street banks a way to eliminate laws and regulations that get in the way of their profits. Right now, they're trying to get something called fast-track authority, so this massive giveaway can pass without any public review or power to amend. So we have to say loud and clear, no to fast-track and no to the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
That video was made before the vote in Congress on fast track for the TPP. And fast track is Trade Promotion Authority, in which Congress actually voluntarily gives up their constitutionally enumerated power to regulate foreign trade and give it to the executive branch, in which the executive branch then can negotiate trade agreements, and then when it is brought back to Congress, but negotiate trade agreements, sign them, and then when they're brought back to Congress, Congress does not have the right to amend it. Like any other bill, Congress does not have the right to amend, and also, if it's brought up, it has extremely expedited system where there's no regular committee hearings, and it has to be voted on within a certain amount of time, voted up or down. Again, no amendments. That did pass, and as I was saying before, in terms of an entirely different presentation, the fact that all the headlines that I've seen, or many of them, say, Trump kills TPP. And some of the analysis is white people concerned for their jobs elect Trump. Trump kills TPP. I wanted to play the next video, which is a video put out by the U.S. AFL-CIO, American Federation of Labor and Council of Industrial Organizations, the coalition of unions, which gives you some idea of the forces that have been fighting against TPP for the last several years. And it's not just white folks.
TPP nos haría más difícil organizar a los trabajadores.
TPP could mean fewer work opportunities for local residents.
El TPP significaría menos dinero para cubrir las necesidades de mi familia.
TPP significaría tener medicamentos más caros.
TPP could mean companies write my country's food labels and safety standards.
TPP significaría comida nociva y contaminación ambiental.
TPP is a trade and globalization agreement between 12 countries. And even after negotiations are finished, more countries can join.
TPP could make it harder to organize workers.
TPP could mean deforestation.
TPP could mean more overfishing.
Le TPP pourrait vouloir dire que notre voix ne sera plus écoutée.
That video was put out by the AFL-CIO along with labor federations of every country involved in TPP except Vietnam, where the labor federations would not be allowed to speak against government policy, and Brunei, where all the rules are made by the Sultan of Brunei, and they have no collective bargaining rules whatsoever. And so, part of my concern this morning is, as I've said, after fighting with a multinational, very diverse coalition for 8 years against TPP, that not only Donald Trump getting credit for killing it, but also people then may look at the narrative that Donald Trump has been giving about trade and think that that is the actual argument. And Donald Trump's position on trade, just like so many of his other positions, is wrapped in a white supremacist veneer, in which, when he speaks about NAFTA, he talks about that the Mexican negotiators hoodwinked the U.S. negotiators. Or when he talks about China and the WTO, the Chinese negotiators were so much smarter than the U.S. negotiators and just got everything they wanted. And nothing could be further from the truth. And all of these trade agreements, they were brainchild, they were thought up on Wall Street, in corporate boardrooms, mainly in the United States, and in Washington, D.C. And pretty much 95 to 100% of everything that corporations wanted, U.S. corporations and U.S. politicians and went into these free trade agreements. When Donald Trump talks about Mexicans stealing our jobs, talks about Chinese workers stealing our jobs, the only way that could actually happen is if these Mexican workers and Chinese workers were sneaking into U.S. boardrooms of corporations to vote to send these jobs to Mexico or to send them to China. But when you look at the history of these free trade agreements, if, in fact, Mexican workers or Chinese workers had that power, if they voted to send those jobs to those countries, they wouldn't have turned what many of those jobs, very good paying jobs that could send children to college and that could feed your family, that could give you a decent lifestyle, when these same jobs are sent to Mexico by these CEOs of these corporations or sent to China. They're in factories that are very dangerous to work in, where people are not paid enough to sustain their family, where factories in China where they had to put nets outside of the dormitories because so many of the young people were committing suicide, jumping out of their dormitory windows. And that has been principally the what these free trade agreements have brought to workers in the developing countries. Another thing Donald Trump, of course, talks about is what he calls illegal immigration and using undocumented workers as a scapegoat for all of America's problems, while at the same time talking about that Mexican workers are stealing our jobs, when the fact is that NAFTA, in its first few years, actually destroyed the family farm communities in Mexico, forcing more than 2 million Mexican farm families off their land into the cities, and where a lot of time the choice was go to work for cartels or come to the United States to try to find a better life for their families. And so they pretty much have it both ways. The people in Congress who have voted for these free trade agreements, which then force people out of their countries into the U.S. as a cheap labor force, then they can attack them for coming to the U.S. They say they're stealing our jobs to Mexico. They're stealing our jobs, sending them to Mexico, and when immigrants come to the United States, they steal our jobs. When the fact is both issues are very much connected to policies that they themselves, that members of Congress, voted for. I think most of y'all have a handout in which when NAFTA, the first free trade agreement, was being pushed, the argument was this is going to increase imports, it's going to increase exports. We're going to have great new jobs created in the United States. We're going to have great new jobs created in developing countries like Mexico. So we're going to have a more balanced trade, better standard of living in both countries. We've had 23 years of experience with NAFTA now. In Texas, it's meant more than 70,000 manufacturing jobs since 1994, since NAFTA and the World Trade Organization took effect. 75,000 manufacturing jobs have disappeared. Nearly 5 million manufacturing jobs have been lost nationwide. More than 172,000 specific Texas jobs have been certified. These are verified by U.S. government program. These jobs either were outsourced and sent outside of the U.S. or disappeared because of competition from cheap imports. It's 172,000 jobs, which this is a program, the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, that really, one, you have to know that you have to apply for it. A lot of companies shut down. Workers didn't know that this was available. So at the very minimum, NAFTA, in the NAFTA era, Texas has lost more than 172,000 jobs. And, you know, the old saying, which I hear several people attributed to, that if you do the same thing over and over and you think you're going to get a different result, that's the definition of insanity. That's basically what U.S. policy has been on free trade for 23 years. Every time that they come up with a new agreement, they say, oh, well, this is better than the old agreement. This works out the kinks. This will be really good, and this will bring prosperity to all countries involved. And as far as I know, every free trade agreement, with the possible exception of the Australia-U.S. free trade agreement, in every case, we actually have the U.S. has a worse balance of trade, and that is less exports going to those countries that we negotiated a free trade agreement with, and more exports coming to the United States. And again, who benefits from that? Corporations benefit from it. The economic elites of both countries benefit. But in overwhelming majority of cases, family farmers and working class has been hurt tremendously. And of course, it's more and more happening in high-tech industry too. When trade agreements were first started, they said, oh, we need to get rid of we need this dirty factory work. We're going to do service and high tech, and we'll send this dirty factory work to areas that really need it in the third world. And as I'm sure all of you are aware, in fact, Austin's been hit by it as much as any place in the country in terms of tech jobs being sent to India, China, other developing countries, where the pay is, in some cases, a fifth of what the same job would be in Texas or in the United States. So when in 2008, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton ran against each other for the Democratic nomination, in the primary, trade was a big issue. And because since the Democrats had taken over Congress in 2006, the Democratic majority, Nancy Pelosi, had blocked 3 new free trade agreements that had been negotiated by the Bush administration, the Korea, Colombia, and Panama free trade agreements. They had blocked fast track for those agreements, and they had blocked voting on those agreements. And during the primary, particularly in the Rust Belt states, both the Clinton and Obama campaigns campaigned against all of those 3 free trade agreements. And the last debate that the President and Secretary Clinton had at that time, it was basically both of them saying to the other, you're not really against free trade. Your record shows you're not really against free trade. I am, you're not. Unfortunately, almost exactly a year later, after those debates, and after the Obama administration came into office and after Secretary Clinton became Secretary of State, they both made statements supporting the Korea Free Trade Agreement, the Colombia Free Trade Agreement, and the Panama Free Trade Agreement. And at that point, the Obama administration, in one of the very few flip-flops that the president made, they flip-flopped and were in support of those 3 trade agreements. You know, most of the groups I speak to, the first question I get is, why does the president support this? And if one of you wants to ask that at the end, I'll just tell you now, I have no idea. I can't explain it. I think that Barack Obama will go down really as one of our greatest presidents historically, because he saved the auto industry. And if he had not saved the auto industry with the auto bailout, all of U.S. industry would have collapsed. If the auto industry goes down, rubber, steel, synthetics, glass, all industry, plastics, collapses. And it's something that he took a lot of flack for. That was something he didn't have to pass through Congress. He took funds that were left over from the bailout, the bank bailout, and he single-handedly saved industry, basically saved our economy. And then to have him promoting a free trade agreement that would harm the economy, particularly in light of history of when they actually did pass the 3 free trade agreements. When in October of 2011, the Panama, Korea, and Colombia free trade agreements were passed, I think within about 6 hours in Congress. And that night on the evening news, it wasn't reported anywhere. I looked at every channel, everything I could, nothing reported. The Korea Free Trade Agreement, which was one of the largest ones we'd had since NAFTA, the president had told our U.S. Trade Representative Ron Kirk to go back in and renegotiate it to make it more advantageous for the auto industry and for the meat industry in the United States. It was renegotiated, and in the 3 years now that it's been in, or 4 years that it's been in effect, the areas, not only do we have a massively larger trade deficit with South Korea, exactly the opposite of what we said we were trying to get, But those industries that have been hurt the most and the industries in which workers have lost their jobs are auto and poultry and pork and, beef industries. So they got exactly the opposite effect in that trade agreement than what was being promoted. I'm sure the president honestly wanted the effect that he said he wanted to have, and that was to increase American jobs. It turned out exactly the opposite. When the Trans-Pacific Partnership was finally revealed, and I say revealed because it was the most secretively negotiated trade agreement in the history of the U.S., it basically was not in many ways different than the Korea Free Trade Agreement. And we already had the example of Korea and what it had done to the trade deficit with Korea and loss of American jobs. And so, the organization that I work for, the Citizens Trade Campaign, the Texas Fair Trade Coalition is the state affiliate of the Citizens Trade Campaign, which is an organization that includes unions, environmental groups, churches, religious organizations, family farm organizations, immigrant rights organizations, Trans-Africa. When we started and saw that TPP was actually as bad or worse as we'd been saying it was, based on statements from the USTR and also based on leaks during the negotiation. The coalition was able to put together a letter of 1,500 organizations sent to Congress, urging that Congress oppose TPP. And if you look through the signers, there's not a Tea Party organization or a Republican organization or a Trump organization in here. There is the Austin Central Labor Council, Arkansas Farmers Union, Bayer County Federation of Teachers, Access to Medicine Coalition, United Methodist Church General Board, Church and Society, Witness for Peace. So this is the coalition that's been working for more than 8 years. Actually, coalition that's been working since before NAFTA was passed to try to turn U.S. trade policy towards fair trade rather than free trade, or at least free trade as it's been determined by these agreements. The TPP was revealed after Fast Track had been voted on by Congress. Again, Fast Track was the procedure by which took away the right of Congress to amend and expedited it and really truncated any debate on the issue. Fast Track vote the margin was 10 votes, which means that if we had flipped 5 votes, it would have been a tie and it would have been dead. And as in any free trade vote that there's been since the beginning, since NAFTA, the overwhelming majority of Democrats voted against Fast Track. 28 Democrats voted for it. 50 Republicans joined the majority of Democrats and voted against Fast Track. And so during this period between the vote on Fast Track, approximately a little more than a year ago, this coalition has been able to put more pressure on members of Congress to where we felt we had a very good chance, if it were brought up during the lame duck session, a very good chance of defeating it. And that it's very clear that the administration and the Republican leadership in Congress, who also supported TPP, did not have a vote count that they could pass it. They were sure that they could pass it. You had a lot of members saying they were undecided. During this time, you had the political campaigns. Martin O'Malley, Bernie Sanders, and Secretary Clinton all came out against TPP. You'll still find a lot of articles talking about that Hillary Clinton was just taking this position as that she would change as soon as she became president. I think that's clearly wrong from looking at what she had said during the campaign and from looking at her arguments against TPP, that once she saw the finished documents, and that if you look at her book, Hard Choices, and this surprised me when she came out against TPP. That surprised me that the book Hard Choices, which was a year before, listed the things that she wanted to see that TPP had to have for her to support it. And TPP did not have those things. And among those were a way to fight currency manipulation by particularly the Chinese government, in which they will manipulate their currency to make their products cheaper, artificially cheaper than U.S. products, and make them more advantageous to import those cheaper goods. Enforceable provisions on labor and environmental standards, and that it would definitely make increase in living standards in the United States. And when TPP didn't provide those things, she came out against it. Unfortunately, Donald Trump also, with his finger to the wind, saw what was happening in the U.S. and saw people that were hurting from this, and made it a centerpiece of his campaign. And there's a lot of analysis of exactly why he won, but it's very clear that he used the trade issue to win the Rust Belt. Unfortunately, like I said before, he used the trade issue wrapped in a veneer of white supremacy, of white supremacist thinking, of not only pointing out how bad the trade agreements had been for U.S. workers, but making it appear as if workers in the developing world had actually benefited from these trade agreements. So at this point, in looking forward, we're not, I don't think on any issue anybody can say they know what Donald Trump's going to do. I read something just yesterday that he said his first day in office he was going to initiate the process for the U.S. to withdraw from NAFTA. And that was very popular among industrial workers in the Midwest. And then to renegotiate NAFTA. I have no idea what that means, what a Donald Trump renegotiated NAFTA means. I have a pretty good idea. His idea of fair trade is not going to be our idea of fair trade. A pretty good idea that the union movement, churches, family farmers, environmental groups that have fought for fair trade all these years, that his supposed fair trade agreements will have the same type of issues involved. For instance, worker standards, environmental standards, that type of thing. So we really just have to see exactly what his version will be, because the narrative he's put forth is so completely devoid of the actual facts on the ground of what these trade agreements are. And I'm wondering whether he even knows how he's going to negotiate a really great, really huge, really wonderful agreement as he keeps saying that he will. I'm not sure how much more time I have.
Is it working? Okay. It's time for questions. Make sure you can see, help us to see if you have a question. I'll bring the microphone to you. And please keep your questions brief so everybody has a chance to ask a question. So I think, Eric. Hartman has our first question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carolyn. And thanks for the talk, Bob. This is illuminating.
Thank you.
One thing I'd like you to react to is a claim made in the New York Times yesterday in an article by Jackie Calms entitled, "What is Lost by Killing the Trans-Pacific Partnership?" She recites a lot of things, but focuses especially on labor, and says, "The agreement would have committed all parties to the International Labor Organization's principles prohibiting child labor, forced labor, and excessive hours, and requiring collective bargaining, a minimum wage, and safe workplaces." She also claims that there were separate agreements with 3 countries that went even further than that, and would have said that those countries would commit to specific labor guarantees and would agree that the U.S. could restore tariffs against them if they didn't comply. So that sounds like stout language on labor rights. I wanted your reaction.
I was in a meeting, I guess, a year ago, in which U.S. Trade Representative Michael Froman and Celeste Drake, who is the trade specialist for the AFL-CIO, were also attended. And when Mr. Froman, or Ambassador Froman, presented the same issues that you're saying, that the TPP was wonderful in that it had all these guarantees and enforceable standards for labor issues, Celeste pointed out that in the advisory committee to the U.S. Trade Representative on TPP, the Labor Advisory Committee, which was majority of whom were the presidents of international unions in the United States, that not one single suggestion of theirs wound up in TPP. And that you can actually go on the USTR website and find the report of the Labor Advisory Committee, in which they explain in detail how all these really great sounding phrases and sections and TPP have no teeth, cannot be enforceable, based on previous free trade agreements that also had environmental and labor protections, that they have not been enforceable. They have not done what they're supposed to do. And let me see, I think you had another part of your question.
Well, I think you pretty well covered it, but I did say that there were some side agreements that were also contingent, apparently, on completion of the TPP, with 3 countries making even further commitments.
Right. You know, one of the issues that you raised was, I think, was child trafficking, and the TPP, in order to have Malaysia stay a member of TPP, and may have my years, it may have been February of this year or February of last year. In February, the State Department had released their report on human rights, and they named Malaysia, which is a member of TPP, as one of the worst human rights violators in terms of slavery and sexual trafficking, and trafficking of women and children. And that being the case, according to U.S. law, the United States cannot have a trade agreement with a company that's on that list. Less than 3 months later, Malaysia either cleaned up their act, which has been going on for a long, long time, or the State Department was pressured into changing their listing of them on the bad actors list. And most people thought that that was done in order to allow Malaysia to stay within the TPP. So we feel that not only were these supposed enforceable standards not enforceable, didn't have teeth, but the TPP actually was used to get Malaysia off the hook and Malaysia does not face certain sanctions and that they would have otherwise. So another issue that come up are the environmental standards in TPP, which the USTR and the administration kept saying were the finest and the most enforceable, strongest that had ever been seen. But what people have been raising quite often is that the same was said about the Peru Free Trade Agreement and very strong environmental standards, which were actually put in as a compromise that George Bush put in as a sweetener to get Democrats to try to support the Peru Free Trade Agreement. Within the last year or so, Peru basically got rid of all their environmental laws in terms of deforestation. Nothing's been done. The U.S. hasn't acted, and it's another example of saying and doing the same thing, and then having the same result, and that is environmental devastation, which has been brought about by these free trade agreements, particularly in developing countries.
We have a question from Fred Higgins.
Yes, your comments over the last 3 minutes have started to clarify my question. But you're speaking at a senior class level, and I'm asking a freshman class question, I guess. Could you describe in as few words as possible the difference between fair trade and free trade?
I guess the easiest thing to say would be fair trade would be trade that would benefit the broadest number of people in all the countries involved, rather than the smallest number in the economic elite. And it's the contention of the folks who have been in the fair trade movement that free trade agreements have done exactly that they've been a perfect storm. They actually work exactly like they're supposed to work. Economic elites in the United States, economic elites in Mexico and Canada have benefited greatly from free trade. And that's one of the reasons that you can, they'll say, look at the profits that these companies have made, or look at the imports that are coming in that from other countries. And so that means that those countries have benefited from these trade agreements. When you really look at it, the beneficiaries have been the small number at the top. And in terms of exactly how you make a fair trade agreement, Senator Sherrod Brown, actually at the beginning of the Obama administration, and when I took this job in January of 2009, I thought that was really what we were going to be doing, was not fighting free trade anymore, but actually fashioning fair trade policies. And Sherrod Brown had introduced a fair trade bill, which listed those things that had to be in an agreement, in a trade agreement. Nobody in the fair trade movement that I've been involved in is against trade. We think trade is a good thing. We think trade could really increase trade between countries, can help everybody involved. But when it's put together specifically just on the basis of making the highest profit for corporations, it's not going to be fair. Of course, one thing in a fair trade agreement would be enforceable labor standards and enforceable environmental standards. It's been interesting. I've been spending a lot of time in El Paso recently. Congressman Beto O'Rourke, he voted for fast track. And so we've been working with him, trying to convince him to do otherwise. And I think we're kind of on the road to reaching that point with him. But one thing that he does say correctly about El Paso is that their economy is linked to the economy of Ciudad Juarez, and that if you had labor standards, one of the reasons he gave is leaning maybe towards TPP, because he thought that there were going to be these labor side agreements that Eric was talking about. And talking about how the abysmal working conditions and pay of Mexican maquiladora workers in Juarez not only was a downward pressure on wages in El Paso, but also most of those workers shop in El Paso. And that if you had a situation where you had actually enforceable labor standards where Mexican workers could organize for collective bargaining, receive more pay, it's extremely unlikely that they're going to become uncompetitive with U.S. wages. You're still going to have companies, you're still going to have jobs that will be in Mexico because of those wages. But if Mexican workers make enough money to buy products that U.S. workers make, then that's how you get a balance. That's how you get exports going out and imports going in, and all sectors of society being benefiting from these trade agreements. The TPP, for instance, is 5,000 pages long. So in terms of a fair trade agreement, there's a lot of technical issues that I couldn't even begin to tell you about. But in terms of enforceable labor and environmental standards, and one other thing that just stands out as totally and completely unfair in every way is the ISDS system, that is the investor state dispute system that's set up by NAFTA. And it is included in every free trade agreement that the United States has negotiated, except for the Australian free trade agreement. The Australian government refused to accept it. And that is the system that Robert Reich referred to, in which international trade courts that are tribunals with 3 judges decide cases brought by corporations against governments for government policies that they say are interfering in their right of free trade, that they're non-tariff interference in fair trade. And these horrible, terrible non-tariff interference in fair trade include things like minimum wage laws, environmental laws, and for the most part, in the history of these trade agreements, it's the developing countries that have been harmed the most by these courts, which, by the way, the judges that sit on these courts are international trade attorneys who 1 week will be sitting on one of these courts interpreting whether this or that country has been fair to this or that corporation, and the next week representing corporations, maybe the same corporation. So, and completely outside of the bounds of the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. judicial system. And while if you talk to the USTR, to the U.S. Trade Representative, Michael Froman, and I've heard him say this many times, there's nothing in TPP that can make the U.S., that can overturn a law in the U.S. And that's true, or any other country. That's true. But they can make them pay billions of taxpayer money if they enforce that law. And so what happens is not only have some countries backed away from passing stronger labor protections, stronger environmental protections, because they're being threatened with one of these suits, which cost millions of dollars to defend. But also now there's evidence that hedge funds and other groups are buying companies with the intention of filing these kind of suits. In other words, buying companies where a company will be bought by a group that has no intention of actually producing these products or opening this mine or this type of thing, but they're looking for those areas that they can file suit, buy a company and file suit, and which is just just horrible. USTR also talks about that the U.S. has never lost one of these, that they've been filed against the U.S., but we haven't lost one. Now, first of all, that means really don't care about the developing country. We don't care about those countries that we sign these agreements with that have lost millions and billions and lost rights and lesser and higher standards. But with the TPP, which will include industrialized countries like Australia and Japan, even Singapore, it would increase the likelihood of more and more of these types of suits against U.S. government and even state government policies, which, for instance, California has, because they have the highest, probably, environmental standards, they have, I believe, had more NAFTA suits filed against them. And they haven't lost any of them. But maybe 4 years ago, I was told, they hadn't lost any, but they had spent $100 million in taxpayer money defending those. So that's $100 million to defend a law or a regulation or a court decision which has been ruled constitutional under our system, but by which they face the possibility of having to pay millions or billions of dollars for enforcing that law.
We have a question from Becky Halpin.
Thank you. You've been great. You have so much knowledge about all this. So what about the Trade and Services Agreement? I've been reading something about that. Are you familiar with that agreement?
I have to tell you, I'm not really that familiar with it. One reason is because, just like TPP, it's being negotiated in secret. The leaks that we've had, I know that a lot of folks who do know more about that say it's the most dangerous, that it's worse than TPP, that it's worse than TTIP, which is the trade and investment, transatlantic trade and investment partnership, which is also probably dead because TPP is dead. TISA is the trade and services. And one thing that I do know that was leaked is that, the U.S. Postal Service is told that and one of the reasons we have great rural postal service is that it's mandated that they must, serve rural communities. And it had been leaked that in terms of privatization of services, which of course mail service is a service, and a lot of these services are governmental services, that TISA would pretty much do away with that mandate and open up postal service by privatization of the postal service. Now, I can't say that's the case because it's just like TPP held, the negotiations are completely in secret. But those that do know, I've heard this said many a times, that TISA is actually more dangerous than either TPP, and would bring more disastrous results, particularly government services, than TPP or TTIP.
Thank you for your insightfulness and your sharing your experience with us about the depth of these things. Two quick questions. One is, you mentioned that the beneficiaries of these agreements are often the people who control these multinational companies. So for the first time, I realized that this is sort of a global economic imperialism, that a global economic greed that is in the control of a handful of peoples, if I got your message correctly. Second, if you'd comment on that. And the second question is, you talked about privatization in the upcoming administration. What are some of the expectations of privatization that we should be on the lookout for?
On your first comment, I have to say, yes, that's what it appears like to me, too. I would have to say when, being in the labor movement, being a factory worker for the first 17 years of my job experience, knowing people who were laid off and that type of thing, my first concern was that these trade agreements, how much harm they were doing to U.S. families. And then when I actually started looking at the issue deeper and deeper, it was incredible how much harm these trade agreements have done to working families all over the entire world. And you have to say, well, who is benefiting? And for instance, Mexico, where it was supposed to create jobs and create good paying jobs, the wages have actually gone down. Average wage has gone down since NAFTA was passed, factory wage. But NAFTA has produced 40 billionaires in Mexico, much of it from privatization, the privatization of land that they had to get a constitutional amendment to do away with the land reform that the Mexican Revolution had brought, and this is what forced 2 million, families off their land. And you'd say, this thing really didn't work out like they were telling us it was going to. Seemed like the next one they'd really try to fix that, and then same old, same old. Some cases worse. So you'd have to say that yes, in general, it's if not a conspiracy, it's certainly an agreement on the part of most economic elites, and that's whether you're in a CEO in a boardroom in New York City or on the Politburo in a more state-controlled economy like China, that they have benefited and majority of people have not. The second question, if I remember it correctly, I don't know how things are going to develop with this administration. I know that in general they're going to be for privatization. Now, whether they will push trade agreements, which increase privatization like TISA, it's, in some ways I think it's going to be very difficult for the Trump administration, after giving such a wildly inaccurate description of these trade agreements and how they work, to come up with something that the American people and even Trump supporters will think is fair.
I think our time is about drawn to a close.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming
Sure.
out today. Let's
Thank
give
you.
Mr. Cash a hand.